first death in the FNAF timeline is a part of the lore that has been debated for a very long time, and when it comes to this, there can only be one right answer. In this video, we will cover the major possibilities and the arguments presented for each, in hopes to find the one true answer. So, I know this is a topic that has been covered to death, but seeing as my channel centers around storylines, I thought I should begin to detail my thoughts on the story of the FNAF franchise, the series of horror games that is arguably best known for its complicated lore. The topic of who dies first has been a very popular discussion point for theorists on YouTube, so I figured I'd compile all of the evidence we have on this early section of the timeline, as well as the most popular theories and why they are believed. Obviously, all of this will be working towards what I believe to be true, using the evidence system I use when lore hunting series like this. Basically, there's 4 different categories that evidence can generally be applied to. Factual evidence, which is something that is indisputable. Speculative evidence, something that isn't necessarily unlikely, but doesn't have anything tangible backing it up. Narrative evidence, which is interpreting things to meet a narrative satisfaction or coherent story. This evidence often doesn't stand on its own, but when paired with factual evidence can make for a very compelling argument. And finally, double-edged evidence, which is taking something that could potentially be construed or interpreted in a different way than what you're using it for. Generally, for a theory to be well constructed, there needs to be factual evidence and narrative evidence sort of working together, whereas speculative evidence and double-edged evidence should be reserved as supporting information only and never the crux of a claim. With that system in mind, let's see how it relates to the FNAF timeline, specifically the earliest death. And before we delve into the details, it's always good to acknowledge exactly why this is so important. Obviously, it is necessary for making an objective timeline, which for us lore hunters is reason enough, but as most FNAF fans already know, the first death is especially influential to the background and motivations of the series' main villain, William Afton. On this note, let's gather all of the realistic potential candidates for this position and put them on the board. How I see it, and how I think the vast majority of the FNAF fandom sees it, there are only 3 real possibilities for the first death: the crying child, aka the youngest Afton's son, Elizabeth Afton, or Charlie Emily. There have been other possibilities that briefly made their rounds, such as the suggestion of Susie, the spirit of the girl that possessed the Chica animatronic, mostly due to her famous voice line.
I was the first. I have seen everything.
However, Susie was a part of the missing children's incident, which some of the books indicate happened in 1985. And yes, I know we can't take those books as gospel, but seeing as this is a very particular detail that doesn't break anything that the games tells us, I think it can be trusted. And even if 1985 isn't technically the exact date of the MCI in the game timeline, I bet it would be within that vicinity. That would be a very weird and deliberate thing for the books to tell us if it wasn't remotely true, and we know the MCI kids have to be dead and possessing their respective animatronics before 1987, thanks to FNAF 2. It is much more likely that Susie was just the first murder of the 5 involved in the MCI. The important thing about all of this is that the crying child definitely died in 1983 due to the date we see in the FNAF 4 minigames, meaning that whoever died first has to be either earlier in the same year or in a year prior. The crying child's death date is an example of something we can put in factual evidence and keep it to build off of. Another point to this is that in Henry's speech in the insanity ending of the pizzeria simulator, he says,
"I undo what he has done and heal this wound. A wound first inflicted on me, but then one that I let bleed out to cause all of this."
This is undoubtedly referring to the murder of his daughter Charlie at William Afton's hand. And if it was a wound first inflicted upon Henry, that heavily implies Charlie was Afton's first murder, discounting any of the MCI or DCI kids immediately, or anyone else you believe that was murdered by Afton. In the books, Charlie's death is also known to have occurred in 1983, like the crying child's in the games. I just wanted to get this out of the way at the beginning to reaffirm that we will be treating only these 3 children as serious possibilities. Let's first talk about the crying child's sister, that being Elizabeth Afton. Elizabeth was formally introduced in FNAF's sister location, the 5th installment in the games. Technically, we saw hints of her before. In FNAF 4, we see an empty room with pink colors in the Afton home, which first suggested the presence of a daughter of William Afton. Now, the significance of this room has been much debated. Some theorists claim that the fact that the room is empty in FNAF 4 is supposed to indicate that she was already dead as of that game. Seeing as the minigames portion takes place in 1983 and before the crying child's death, that would indeed make her death incredibly early. However, this evidence isn't very strong. As many people who oppose this idea have pointed out, an empty room doesn't have to equate to the child who should inhabit it being dead. They could be literally anywhere else, perfectly alive. The main argument for the empty room signifying Elizabeth being dead is that most details aren't put in this series lightly, and purposely including a room that so obviously hints at a girl in the family, only for her to never appear in-game, is a context clues for the players to pick up on the fact that she has died. What's also interesting is that FNAF 4 was once supposed to be the finale to the series, so many fans wonder what the heck a sudden inclusion of an unseen sister is even supposed to add to the plot of the time. Now that we have sister location, it is easy to look back and appreciate the foreshadowing, but that wouldn't have been the intent at the time if it was designed for FNAF 4 to be the conclusion. This whole thing borders on double-edged evidence, as you could argue back and forth about how much significance an empty room has all day without really getting anywhere. However, I think it best fits in speculative evidence, as it is factual that the room is empty and the girl is never seen in FNAF 4, but theorizing that it definitely signifies Elizabeth is dead is kind of interpretive. That being decided, what is the factual evidence about Elizabeth that we have? Perhaps most importantly, we know exactly how Elizabeth died since we see the event happen in a minigame from Sister Location. An animatronic known as Circus Baby, who serves ice cream to the children and has been designed to also claw, kill, and trap the body of a child if they are completely alone. Obviously, this deadly design choice was done by William Afton to satisfy either his bloodlust for child murdering or perhaps other motives we'll talk about soon. But while William is a serial killer of other children, it does seem that he wants to protect his own, as we hear Elizabeth say this.
Daddy, why won't you let me play with her? Daddy, you let the other children go see her. Why won't you let me go?
William didn't want his daughter getting near this deadly animatronic, but one day she disobeyed his orders and gave in to the temptation of trying to play with Circus Baby, to which she was violently killed by a stomach claw. This is a piece of factual evidence. We literally see this happen. Obviously, the question would be at what time was Circus Baby created, so we could know the earliest date Elizabeth could have been killed, but unfortunately that is somewhat ambiguous, which allows for theorists to put it at slightly different points in the timeline and not really be totally incorrect. Another thing we can put under factual evidence is the fact that Circus Baby was supposed to be a part of Circus Baby's Pizza World, which was closed after only one day of operation due to alleged gas leaks, although we can all assume it was actually due to Elizabeth's untimely death. The animatronics of this establishment included the Funtime animatronics, designed by Afton Robotics, which we have seen the blueprints for. By looking at these blueprints, it becomes quite apparent that these animatronics were fundamentally designed for killing and capturing kids. With this in mind, that means that if Elizabeth were to be the first death in the timeline, that means we can't really find a specific motive for William Afton to be trying to stealthily kill children with these Funtime animatronics. Under this theory, that would mean he is just a sadistic killer with bloodlust for the young, and would go through all of the trouble to make an entire cast of robots just to carry out these murders. Also, it would create this weird situation where William would go from using robots to kill to downgrading to killing by hand, like the 5 kids involved in the MCI. However, some theorists argue that because the Funtimes didn't work as planned, he just decided to do it himself. Also, it is possible and narratively reasonable that the Funtimes were designed for the harvesting and experimenting of Remnant, which is the metaphysical stuff that allows for souls to possess objects like animatronics. If William was after the harvest and experimentation of Remnant, that would give him plenty of motivation for designing the Funtimes the way he did. However, for this to be the case, William would have to know of the existence of Remnant, which requires him murdering a child and witnessing their possession of an animatronic prior to creating them. Obviously, this would mean that someone else would have had to die before Elizabeth. Now, these supposed problems with the idea of Elizabeth first being motive and possible remnant involvement can only go on the narrative evidence and may be speculative as well. For many, the idea of the main villain not having much of an origin story, besides just being insane and evil, isn't very appealing or likely for a fictional story, but at the end of the day, that's just using narrative satisfaction as an argument. That being said, fictional stories usually do make their villains a bit more dynamic, so I do find the need for a motive for William to be a pretty decent argument. Going further with the evidence used in favor of Elizabeth dying first, we know from the text boxes in the FNAF 4 minigames that the crying child saw something, which is probably related to his chronic fear of the animatronics. Theorists have proposed that he saw Elizabeth get clawed by Circus Baby, and believers in the idea that the FNAF 4 gameplay is the crying child's nightmares point to the fact that Nightmare Fredbear has a mouth on his stomach, which is where the claw that killed Elizabeth came from. The crying child had to have seen something, so that's factual, but the notion that what the crying child saw was Elizabeth's death is only speculative. It also borderlines on double-edged, as many people think that the crying child just misconstrued something that made him scared of the animatronics, such as someone being put into the costume as seen in the FNAF 4 minigames, complemented with the hint from the creator, what's seen in the shadows can be easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. And finally, people will also point to the mound of dirt in the Midnight Motorist minigame from Pizzeria Simulator. This dirt mound looks suspiciously like a grave, and some believe that it is Elizabeth's. I've heard some reason that since the true nature of Elizabeth's death would have to be covered up by William, there wasn't a traditional burial, and William had to bury his daughter somewhere nearby his home in an unmarked grave. Seeing how vague Midnight Motorist is about everything in it, this can't be anything more than speculative evidence. So now that all the important information used in the arguments for and against Elizabeth dying first have been laid out, what can we conclude about the young girl? Personally, I don't think she was the first death in the series, and in fact find her to be by far the least likely out of the three possibilities. The biggest thing working against her, in my opinion, is the strangeness and motive for William Afton under this scenario. Not only would he be just a sadistic child murderer for no decipherable reason, he has built animatronics whose purpose is to find random isolated children to kill and capture. This would mean William simply likes the idea of killing kids. He doesn't even bother to get the thrill of the kill by doing it personally, which is a common motivator for serial killers. One would think that his earlier kills, even under the assumption that he is just evil through and through, one would think that he would start off with killing kids by hand if he really enjoyed the idea of enacting death on young people. His other victims, Charlie, the MCI, and the DCI, were all more or less done in this way, and it would just conceptually be cleaner if William did at least one of his hand killings first before he moved on to animatronics doing it for him. Also, as stated before, it does appear very possible that the fun times were created with Remnant in mind, which would have to mean that William either encountered the animatronics possessed by the MCI kids or the puppet possessed by Charlie prior to making them. Also, one thing that seems to work against the idea that the crying child witnessed the death of his sister, Circus Baby could only kill a kid if they were alone. It would be really weird if we were supposed to assume that the crying child was able to watch in just such a way that Circus Baby still detected Elizabeth as alone and went for the kill. I realize that a lot of these things are very narrative-based evidence, but I think it is important to keep in mind that this is a fictional story. In real life, random stuff happens all the time, but stories typically have patterns and interconnected themes, coming together to make a compelling narrative. Elizabeth dying first just doesn't make sense for a sensible storyline, having a lack of motive for our main antagonist, who's going all out on making killing machines, and generally making for a weird order of events when put into the bigger picture. Given the lack of hard factual evidence for her death being the earliest and the lack of dates being attached to the events around her, I personally have to eliminate her from the running of first death. Now, we're left with either Charlie Emily or the crying child. Charlie is the daughter of a man named Henry Emily, who's the co-owner of the Freddy business along with William Afton. Henry is known to have had a large part in the building the animatronics and the general robotics of a lot of their functions, including the puppet that seems to have been designed to protect Charlie. She died after she was locked out of one of the restaurants, which a majority of FNAF fans agree was either Fredbear's or a Freddy's location. It was at this location that she was locked out of that William Afton came and killed her by hand. As stated in this video earlier, in one of his monologues, Henry calls her death a wound first inflicted on me, indicating that she was William Afton's first murder. This seems like a pretty airtight interpretation, but first murder doesn't have to mean first death. as the crying child wasn't intentionally murdered, and neither was Elizabeth really. However, it still means her death has to be very early in the timeline, and the books indicate that it was in 1983, which would line up with her being dead before the MCI and any of Afton's other murders. Going off of this, that means we have to determine if she died before the crying child, as we know he died in the same year. The first thing we run into is similar to the first problem with Elizabeth. Afton's motive for killing her is largely unexplained if she was the first. Now, granted, there are plenty of psychopaths that kill just because they enjoy the thrill or are otherwise insane, which a lot of people attribute this quality to William Afton. A good portion of the fanbase enjoys the idea of the villain being a cold-blooded killer that murders children just because he enjoys it. I will say this complete lack of real motive does make him way less human and more terrifying in general, which is why I think people like this interpretation of the character. Other people suggest that William killed her out of some sort of jealousy for Henry, which as far as I can tell is a concept that is completely borrowed from the books, so isn't unreasonable but also doesn't mean it's exactly what the games are implying. I've heard some theorists also suggest that Charlie's murder was the tragedy that the crying child witnessed, but that is purely speculative and never really made sense to me. Would that mean William was just toting around his youngest son with him when he decided to murder a little girl and just carelessly let him watch? The problem with the debate between Charlie and the crying child for the first death in general is that there just is a lack of concrete evidence that we can go off of. That being the case, we have to turn to the narrative evidence category in an attempt to make the most sense out of it, which a lot of people agree the crying child has the lead on. The crying child is the youngest son of William Afton, whose actual name still remains unclear. We see his death happen in the minigames of FNAF 4, when his older brother Michael Afton and a group of other kids that enjoyed taunting him over his fear of the animatronics shoved him into the mouth of Fredbear, to which the animatronic clamped down his jaws and gave him a head injury he couldn't come back from. The evidence people use to back up his death being the first is that obviously the confirmed date is 1983, which automatically predates almost every other major event of the series, and that the death of this kid would actually give William Afton motivation for his future killing sprees. The other two candidates don't really give William a good, clear motive, so we kinda just have to assume he likes killing kids because he's insane, but under the theory that the crying child dies first, the context for the murder of Charlie makes a lot more sense. Henry was the guy who built a lot of the animatronics, so seeing as the crying child was killed as a result of one, William could have a lot of pent-up rage for his business partner and decided to kill his daughter out of revenge. This first slaying would have then activated William's bloodlust in a sense, or he witnessed the possession of the puppet and went on a quest to study how Remnant works from there. This is all really just narrative evidence, but from a storyline standpoint, it does make a lot of sense as far as the motivations for the main villain of the series goes. Some people also point out that the puppet's existence could indicate that he died first, as Henry wouldn't need to build an animatronic to protect Charlie if a tragedy hadn't already occurred at a location. However, this is double-edged evidence at best for me. Under this logic, Elizabeth could have also been first, and after her disappearance, Henry made the puppet to keep track of the children, or heck, Henry could just be very protective of his daughter. It is believed by a lot of theorists that the Fredbear plush was a monitoring device of sorts for William Afton to watch and speak to his youngest son, and it would be a plot parallel for Henry to do something similar for his daughter by making the puppet, but ultimately, neither one of them could save the kids. The strongest thing going for the crying child is definitely the narrative satisfaction, where our villain gets a clear backstory and motive. So now that we've discussed each child's seriously proposed for the first death, I have to say that I personally believe the crying child makes the most sense. If we go further with narrative evidence, the Freddy locations have been open since the 70s, meaning there was at least a few years where nothing tragic happened. It seems weird to me that William would just chill with a normal business for entertaining children, then suddenly start killing them without some event that made him snap. It also creates a lot of raw tragedy to think about. William helped start this business as a way to bring joy to children and ended up killing his own. It makes for an origin and motive for the main villain. I think it adds another layer to one of Henry's lines too, when he calls William.
It's only now that I understand the depth of the depravity of this creature, this monster that I unwillingly helped to create.
This could be referring to the fact that Henry took a step away from everything and largely disappeared while William was on his murderous rampage, and that it was one of his robots that caused the death that would start William's descent into madness. Also, this is the only time in the series that someone dies without some sort of malicious intent involved. Michael wasn't trying to kill his brother, and the animatronic wasn't designed to kill either. It was all just a tragic accident, which I think makes sense to start the spiral of evil deeds committed afterwards. And when thinking about how FNAF 4 plays out in general, the entire game is building up to the moment that the crying child dies. It is presented as an incredibly dramatic moment that pretty much an entire game is centered around. If all that wasn't to reveal arguably the most important event in the series, the one that started it all, what was all the build up for? And I know most of my argument is centered around narrative evidence, but I think a good thing to remember is that this is a fictional story. In fiction, especially horror, there's usually a well-constructed past or origin story for the villain, and I don't see why William Afton would be an exception. All that being said, I have to personally conclude that the crying child was the first death of the series. This makes the young boy's death the catalyst for everything else that followed in the series, the turning point where everything started to go wrong, spawning all of the horrific tragedies that would follow. But obviously, that's just my interpretation, and while I'm really confident in it, if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear who you believe is the first death in the comments and how it affects the story. If you enjoyed the video, it always helps out if you leave a like and subscribe for more upcoming FNAF content, or videos covering the lore of other series and true crime as well. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below, and until next time, it's been Playmaster.